Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are jumping straight into the source material today, really pulling back the curtain on the making of one of the most commercially successful and, well, let's face it, provocative films of the last decade. Am I racist?
That's right. And just to be clear for everyone listening for this deep dive, we're deliberately sidestepping the actual, content debate of the film itself.
Yeah, that's not our focus here.
No. Our mission is really to understand the creative and logistical engine, I guess, that drove it. We're dissecting the intense production strategy, the immense personal and professional risks the team took.
Huge risk.
Huge. And the underlying creative philosophy, especially that controversial and maybe unconventional use of comedy, which was just absolutely central to achieving their stated goal.
Yeah.
Which was, deep cultural impact.
And the stakes, they couldn't really have been higher, could they? This was the highly anticipated sophomore effort right after the truly seismic impact of What is a Woman? That first film, it didn't just generate headlines. It really sustained conversations for months. It proved the team could create something that lasted, as they put it, longer than a single day.
Yeah, and the sources really reveal this tremendous internal pressure because of that. They realized they hadn't just made a hit movie. They'd basically set a new, almost impossible bar for themselves.
Right.
They felt they absolutely had to keep the momentum going. There was this profound fear of failure, the feeling that they couldn't just limp in with the next project.
Mm-hmm. Can't phone it in.
Exactly. The mandate from the very outset was crystal clear. They had to go bigger, both in terms of the subject matter and the cultural reach they were aiming for.
And that relentless drive, that's precisely what steered them toward what was, by all accounts we have, an even more dangerous, more volatile topic, which of course was race. Now, stepping from transgenderism directly to race, that seems less like a pivot and more like, walking deliberately into a minefield.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources immediately detail this almost physical, kind of visceral sense of dread that just permeated the crew when the idea was first floated.
I can imagine.
Why choose race? Why tackle the issue that, fundamentally defines some of the spot lines in American culture?
Yeah.
The initial risk assessment, it was instantaneous and brutal. They quickly identified that race was just as hot, maybe even hotter than the transgender debate had been when they filmed the project.
And to really get the depth of that dread, you have to remember the exact historical context, right?
Yeah.
This was conceptualized and filmed largely during the summer of 2020.
Yes, peak pandemic summer.
Coinciding with massive civil unrest, huge protests.
Exactly. The sources explicitly state this was a period where whole cities were being burnt down over race. The whole atmosphere was just charged with immediate danger, the threat of real-world violence, and profound professional repercussions. Stepping into that cultural inferno, as, conservative documentarians felt, to some of the crew members, like almost suicidal madness.
Yeah, reading that, I totally understand why one of the creators admitted their first unspoken gut reaction was a definitive capital letter, hell no.
Right. It seems like the only sensible response, honestly.
It does.
And the dread wasn't just about, external risks like confrontations or protests on the street. It was also an internal creative crisis, this massive issue of scope.
Right. Race is.
Yeah.
It's so big. How do you even begin to fit that into, say, a 2-hour documentary?
Exactly. As one source noted, we can't just walk into a studio and say, hey, we're making a documentary about race. It's just
too broad, meaningless almost.
Right. The creative challenge was defining the undefined, finding a really narrow but still explosive angle that could somehow encapsulate the broader conflict.
And what makes this film's genesis, I think, so interesting is that the sources reveal these two entirely conflicting personal philosophies on race within the core team.
Yeah.
Both of which somehow had to be addressed in the final film.
Yes, absolutely. And this philosophical tension, it really becomes the film's narrative foundation. On one side, you had this perspective deeply rooted in the philosophy of the late 20th century.
Right.
One speaker recalled growing up in Los Angeles back in the 80s and 90s, where they were fundamentally taught to not see race as an issue at all.
Ah, the classic colorblind ideal we heard so much about.
Precisely. For this individual, race apparently never really seemed to matter that much in their day-to-day life. And this philosophy held that, the more you talk about race, the more you blatantly acknowledge race.
Okay.
And if the ultimate goal of a harmonious society is to sort of forget racial distinctions, then maybe one should just shut up about it. Let the issue kind of fade into irrelevance.
A very powerful, very classic American belief, for sure.
It is. But the film couldn't exist solely on that principle, right?
Yeah.
Because the sources also detailed a counterview that really spurred the film into motion, which was the growing influence of the DEI landscape, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this undeniable observation observation that marginalized groups, specifically Black, Latino, Indigenous people, are suffering and dying.
So a very different perspective.
Completely different. This latter perspective rejects that shut up or colorblind approach as maybe naive, or it demands instead a radical shift, emphasizing the active, continuous to do the work.
Okay.
So the team recognized that this burgeoning industry, this whole machine of anti-racism, was really driving the national conversation. Therefore, the documentary had to tackle both sides.
So the failure, maybe, of the old colorblind approach to fully solve the problem.
Right. And the terrifying, maybe radicalizing momentum of this new anti-racist apparatus.
So the documentary, it becomes less about finding a simple answer to the question, am I racist? And more about investigating the people who are actively pushing the boundaries of that definition.
Exactly. It's really an investigation into the industry of identity.
Right.
But look, this conceptual danger, it translated into very real, very material risks for the crew. We absolutely have to talk about the livelihood concerns and the very serious threat of blacklisting.
Yeah, the sources bring this up quite a bit. The most prominent example here is the cinematographer and a high-level freelancer.
Right.
The sources describe his previous career as highly successful within what they termed progressive project. I mean, including an extremely prestigious, really high-profile gig filming President Obama in the Oval Office for a liberal outlet.
Yeah, I mean, you can't get much more established than that in certain circles. So Anton had one foot firmly planted in, let's call it mainstream Hollywood, or at least progressive media circles. And being associated with Am I Racist was quite literally risking his entire career stability. Now, while he carefully avoided saying he was formally blacklisted by that prior employer, the sources strongly implied the outcome was basically the same. The calculation was that his liberal contacts would see his name tied to this, provocative film and simply say, oh, Anton's working on that type of project now. Well, he's not going to be working on our projects anymore.
Wow. For a freelancer, I mean, that's not just an artistic disagreement. That's potentially financial ruin.
It's the closing of professional doors. It makes the daily decision to just show up to set incredibly brave, actually. Every crew member was keenly aware, the sources say, that they were tackling massive, massive topics and powerful people. People who could and likely would exert their influence to punish any perceived dissenters, especially those who still relied on the existing infrastructure of Hollywood, for their income.
So the cost of admission for making this film was potentially your entire professional future.
Pretty much, yeah. That was the potential price tag.
Okay, so given those stakes, I mean, losing your job, facing cultural backlash, tackling this impossibly large topic, the strategy had to be radical, right?
It had to be.
The sources emphasized the team quickly realized they couldn't just approach race with, like, earnest max or logical argument. You noted earlier that these methods often don't work against such massive, entrenched cultural.
That's really the critical realization they had. When you're dealing with ideas that have become almost religious or ideological dogma for some people, logic often just fails. It bounces off.
Right.
The team recognized that the conventional means of political debate, that sort of battle and common sense and facts, was just insufficient against the scale of cultural power.
So they chose comedy. They saw humor not as like a distract tool, a crowbar maybe.
Yeah.
The central creative strategy designed to pick the lock of these hard, sensitive issues.
Exactly.
And allow people to actually listen without immediately retreating into defensiveness.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a tactic. It was a deep philosophical mandate for them. The core belief driving the entire project was this, provocative idea that truth is hilarious. And that comedy, through its inherent absurdity, is the form where the truth perhaps speaks for itself best. They weren't trying to use humor to trivialize, not at all.
No.
But rather to elevate the absurdity of the extreme positions being taken on all sides.
That sounds like an incredibly difficult tightrope walk, though. You have to be funny enough to land the joke, but sharp enough to actually land the point.
Oh, incredibly difficult. Exactly. The sources absolutely acknowledge that humor requires an incredible amount of talent to pull off effectively. It's probably the hardest thing to do, one source said.
Yeah.
But they believed it was maybe the only way to cut through the cultural noise and reach an audience that was just burned out on endless, righteous, often angry political debate.
And the mock scenarios they cook up, they perfectly illustrate this commitment to weaponized absurdity, I guess you could call it.
Yes.
Give us some of those examples that really reveal the state of the discourse they were trying to probe.
Well, the intention was clearly to show, rather than just tell, how far the conversation had maybe veered into the ridiculous in some corners. They discuss scenarios like renaming the George Washington Monument to the George Floyd Monument.
Okay, that's a provocative idea right there.
Right. Or the related and increasingly absurd proposals to then, paint that monument black, and subsequently, after painting it black, to increase its height by 30%.
Wow. So these proposals, while they're mock, they're essentially testing the boundaries of the anti-racist framework they're investigating.
Exactly.
By getting people to agree to these, the subjects are kind of revealing the underlying logic, maybe illogic, of the ideology.
They're forcing the ideology, in a way, to follow its own internal rules to a possibly ridiculous conclusion. It's kind of a form of Socratic interrogation, but disguised as performance art.
Which brings us perfectly to the centerpiece of that performance art, the disguise. Matt Walsh realized pretty quickly, the sources say, that if he was recognized...
Instantly game over.
Right. He'd be instantly relegated to the role of an antagonistic outsider. He couldn't be Matt Walsh, the conservative commentator talking to these people. He needed to go deeper undercover, which birthed the character of the woke cultural critic, Professor Grozona.
Yeah, the necessity of this disguise was just paramount. It was meant to be, as they called it, the perfect bad disguise. Something just plausible enough to function in these highly insular progressive circles they were trying to infiltrate.
Right. Not too slick, but believable enough.
Exactly. The sources credit Sean Hampton for actually creating the look, defining the goal as making him appear like Matt Walsh, but just slightly different and slightly more.
It's actually amazing how much effort and logistical planning went into this seemingly, kind of slapdash outfit. They had to be ready to spring into action.
Yeah, that logistical constraint, that was huge. It ruled out complex special effects makeup entirely. They just couldn't afford, say, 7.5 hours of prosthetics if
someone important suddenly became available.
Precise. If, for instance, a key subject like Robin DiAngelo suddenly confirmed an interview for the next day, the disguise had to be something they could on the fly.
And the details of that wig, they were fascinating too. It was made of human hair, apparently.
Yeah.
And the sources note that Matt was initially genuinely uncomfortable with the concept. He even asked logistical questions about the donor.
Like consent?
Specifically, yeah, whether they had given consent for their hair to be used.
Wow. It reveals the deep levels of detail they were thinking about, and frankly, maybe the internal nervousness about performing this role. But there's another famous element of the disguise that was partially determined by external constraints.
Ah, the beard. He insisted on keeping the beard.
Right. He joked about his wife liking the beard and, his face being better from the nose up, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the underlying reason, according to the sources, was actually quite serious and practical. He stated that if he walked in the door without the beard, it would legitimately be traumatizing for his family.
Okay, so a real personal boundary then.
Right. Meaning he couldn't completely erase his own identity for the sake of the film. They just had to work around it, which kind of proved, in a way, that a partial disguise was act efficient.
And the team described the transformation as Clark Kent going into the phone booth, coming out woke.
Yeah.
The change was sudden, transformative. And the part that really, truly surprised the crew, apparently, was that the disguise worked flawless.
They were freaking shocked, is the quote. Freaking shocked that the disguise held up, noting that he wasn't called out even once, not a single time.
Wow.
And they interpreted this success as, well, a sign of how clueless some of their subjects were, that they were maybe so insulated within their own ideological bubble.
But they couldn't see what was right in front of them.
That a slightly different wig and glasses was sufficient to make Matt Walsh, who is, let's face it, a very recognizable figure in certain circles, entirely unrecognizable.
But let's pause there for a second, because this raises kind of an interesting question about the strategy. If the success of the disguise relies on the subjects being clueless, does the film risk alienating a broader audience? People who might feel the filmmakers are just, mocking people who are maybe too sheltered to know any better. Is there a risk of punching down in a way?
That's a really valid point for the viewer to consider. But for the team, according to the sources, the calculation was purely...
Okay.
If the target subjects were insulated enough to be fooled, then in their view, they were insulated enough to reveal the core, maybe unexamined beliefs of the anti-race movement they were studying. The disguise was simply the key to get access.
The skeleton.
Exactly. And the sources really emphasize how crucial this access was by referencing the nuclear football.
Right. The football. That was the specific code name they gave the suitcase carrying the entire entire Grozona wardrobe.
They literally equated the strategic importance of that wig and wardrobe to the film's success with the importance of the nuclear launch code's briefcase carried by the president.
That's incredible.
It tells you everything. If they lost the wig or if the disguise failed somehow, the mission was over. It just underscores how much the entire deep dive into these complex concepts rested on essentially a single flimsy piece of costume.
Okay, so the sources make it abundantly clear that beneath all the theatricality and the, absurd disguise, the production itself was just an unrelentingly stressful, high-stakes operation.
Oh, completely. The sources characterize every single day of shooting with this heavy undercurrent of dread, constant concern, and the feeling that at any moment the whole thing could blow up.
Yeah.
The feeling of exposure was apparently constant. Like every 30 seconds while cameras were rolling, they were anticipating failure, asking themselves, oh my gosh, are we exposed? Are we done?
Oh.
The creators even confessed that they felt they had no right to pull off what we pulled off, suggesting the successful execution felt almost miraculous. Some even credited divine providence for preventing a catastrophic production blowup.
Divine providence, huh? Well, let's delve into some of the specific moments that really define this high-wire act, starting with maybe the biggest one, the Robin DiAngelo interview.
Ah, yes.
The DiAngelo interview.
This was the moment the strategy really paid off, but it was also Matt's first official foray on camera in character.
Right? It was a monumental risk.
Yeah.
Huge. They had a single, seemingly impossible goal for this interview, to get this real person, DiAngelo, who is a central figure in the anti-racism industry.
Right, big name.
To actually pay reparations herself on camera.
That's a huge ask, an audacious goal.
It really is. They went in with only a rough, unscripted outline because, they knew they couldn't possibly script a conversation of this nature. It had to feel real.
Yeah.
It was described internally as the tallest task they wanted to pull off in the entire documentary, the absolute peak. So what made the team realize definitively in that moment that they had actually succeeded, that they'd gotten what they needed?
The triumphant moment, according to the sources, was when DiAngelo finally got up and started gathering her things, clearly uncomfortable, in response to the pressure of the conversation.
The body language told the story.
Exactly. The sources say the director felt pretty immense pride right then, and this collective realization just swept through the team. Okay, we have a movie now.
Wow.
They knew immediately that moment was the end of our film. It was pure gold. That scene single-handedly validated the entire incredibly risky premise of the whole project.
And the sources provide a really critical insight into how that moment was achieved, don't they? It wasn't just the questions, it was Matt's strategic use of silence.
Yes, this is fascinating. Matt is noted in the sources for being very, very comfortable with silence. And in a conversation about such emotionally charged topics, silence is, it's power, isn't it?
It really can be, yeah.
When he asked that loaded question about reparations and just let the silence hang there, just hang in the air, DiAngelo's immediate reaction apparently start looking around,
looking for an escape hatch.
Searching, the source says, for anyone to give her an excuse to not go down the road of her own idea. The silence basically forced her to confront the logical extreme of her own stated beliefs without the easy out of an interruption or a redirect. That moment of visible, totally unscripted discomfort for the subject, that was the proof they needed. That was the goal.
Okay, so that high point, that gold, it contrasts pretty sharply with the logistical chaos they faced in other scenes. Let's turn to the race to dinner scene.
Ah, yes, the dinner scene.
The charming gathering for white women that relied so heavily on awkward cringe humor.
This scene sounds like it was just a nightmare of logistics, confidentiality concerns, and performance anxiety all rolled into one. Well, because of the limited budget and the absolute critical necessity of maintaining secrecy and avoiding, team members had to wear so many hats. It was all hands on deck.
Oh, yeah?
The producer, Rebecca, faced this bizarre. The scene required them, as part of the setup, to hire a Black-owned catering company. That was actually part of the character's political for the dinner.
Okay, but hiring a full catering staff.
Right.
That means dozens of people needing NDAs, huge risk of exposure.
Right, exactly. The risk of leakage was just deemed way too high. So Rebecca made this extraordinary decision to mitigate that risk by minimizing outside staff contact.
How?
She ended up cooking the food herself offsite.
No way. The producer cooked the meal.
Cooked the food, then plated it, and then handed those plates directly to Matt, who was in character as the woke waiter, to serve.
That level of dedication, the producer literally turning into the caterer, that just highlights the extreme confidentiality protocols they felt they had to maintain.
Absolutely. And Matt as the waiter, wasn't just serving food. He was performing an intentional act of, like, passive aggression, actively trolling this dinner, as put it.
What was he doing specifically?
He wasn't just a quiet servant. He was meant to be this uncomfortable, disruptive presence. He was dropping plates, which actually required him to get a Band-Aid after one incident, apparently.
Oh, wow.
And he was aggressively applying butter to people's bread, even when the guests repeatedly said, no, thank you.
Just kept going.
Just kept going. The sources reveal that Matt was actually having to psych myself up each time to go back out there and keep antagonizing them, because personally, he just wanted the awkwardness to stop.
So the performer himself was experiencing the same cringe the audience would later feel watching.
Totally. The stress was apparently so high that his security team, who were watching nearby, were actually placing bets on how long that would last before the subjects finally threw him out.
You're kidding. Bets.
Real bets, yeah.
Yeah.
The estimates ranged from 5 minutes up to a maximum of 20, placing bets on the mission's survivability. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know about the tension. The sources even mention an Indian woman who was on the production team off camera, coming up afterward, genuinely confused, asking someone, hey, what's up with this waiter? He's really throwing off the flow of the dinner.
So even some members of the crew struggled to separate the performance from reality in the moment.
It seems so, yeah. The lines got blurred.
And the scene itself, it was shot for a full hour. That must have meant the editing process massive.
Oh, huge. Justin, the director, had to cut that hour-long cringe fest down to just 7 or 8 minutes for the final.
How did they approach it?
Well, this presented a significant editing challenge, and the sources blame the director's focus. He had to continually remind the editor, look, it's not about these women primarily, it's about Matt inserting himself into their space.
Keep the focus tight on the protagonist, even if he's the antagonist in the scene.
Exact. The narrative needed to focus entirely on Matt's constant, uncomfortable interruption. The goal, explicitly stated, was to make the audience groan a little, to make them want the scene to stop because it was just too uncomfortable.
So the cringe wasn't a side effect, it was the entire point. It was the mechanism for delivering the message.
Precise. The cringe was the...
Okay, now let's move from cringe to chaos. The New York workshop scene, which caused a completely different type of problem, a police incident.
Right. This is a classic example of, logistical risk meeting unexpected real-world risk. First, the technical setup for this scene was apparently immense.
Why was that?
The room they had secured was challenging because it had 360-degree windows, all glass. So if they shot during the day without specialized lighting, everyone would just be silhouetted against the bright.
Which would ruin the visual quality, obviously. You couldn't see faces clearly.
Exactly. So they spent an entire day, full day, pre-rigging sophisticated, heavy lighting equipment, specifically an aperture infinibar mounted high up.
That sounds like a ton of complex gear.
It is, which also means a ton of breakdown time after the shoot. And then right in the middle of things called.
Oh, boy. And what happened immediately following the police arrival is kind of a perfect illustration of that doctrine of every man for himself when the leader is deep undercover.
Yeah, the sources describe the incident with a touch of maybe dark. When the cops showed up, Matt, the leader, the face of the operation, the guy in the wig, fled immediately.
Just gone.
To preserve the disguise, preserve the continuity of the film, leaving his core team behind to deal with the authorities.
Wow. That must have been incredibly stressful for the remaining crewmen.
Had to be. It was described as a very, very stressful day. Not only did the team potentially have to give statements to the police under, considerable duress,
right,
but they then had to face the massive logistical hurdle of breaking down all that complex ceiling-mounted gear, that aperture infinibar, and all the associated rigging under police scrutiny and intense time pressure. It just highlights how quickly an improvised documentary setup can turn into a potential legal liability and a logistical nightmare when the cameras stop rolling and the police arrive unexpectedly.
Okay, our final anecdote from the production trenches brings us to the Washington, D.C. grassroots interview, which were described, maybe paradoxically, as the most fun thing to shoot.
Yeah, it sounds like this was sort of the culmination of their whole high-wire methodology, just flying by the seat of our pants. They were literally just grabbing real people on the National Mall, utilizing the disguise, and operating on sheer adrenaline. They had to secure permits just to be there, which, itself is a bureaucratic headache.
Sure.
Before putting Matt in full character and wig directly in front of random strangers on the street.
And the content they were pushing, it was pure satire, right? Yeah. Asking people to sign a petition for historical redress, which included, among other things, renaming the George Washington Monument to the George Floyd Monument.
Yes, and getting people not just to sign, but to agree to be on camera, voicing support for these increasingly absurd. It relied completely on the crew's ability to coordinate rapidly and maintain perfect confidentiality in a very high-traffic, very public...
And this specific section, this is where the sources offer a really beautiful, small detail about the team chemistry, something that's so often overlooked when we focus just on the star.
Yeah, this is the Benham anecdote. Benham, one of the team members, was apparently freezing cold himself during the...
Okay.
But he repeatedly gave his coat to Kelly, the hair and makeup cold too. The sources specifically note he did this so many times, despite being cold himself.
Wow.
And the seemingly small gesture, it was highlighted in the source material as a real sign of the deep collaboration, the trust, commitment shared by... It emphasizes that the film isn't the same without Ben, and that for every moment of intense dread or stress, there was also this profound commitment supporting...
That level of trust, that kind of operational discipline we just heard about, it really had to come from the top, right? Let's talk a bit about the maestro behind the scenes, Justin Folk, the director.
Yeah.
The sources suggest he is far from the stereotypical, maybe chaotic, freewheeling documentarian.
Oh, absolutely not. He is consistently described in the material we looked at as way more planned and organized and strategic and outlined than most directors the team had ever encountered, whether in Hollywood or elsewhere.
So very structured.
There was apparently nothing arbitrary about the shoot. Every decision had purpose, structure, clear intent. It wasn't just, capturing a ton of footage and telling the editor, okay, figure it out later.
And his unique skill, the sources say, is that he can see the edit while he's shooting. That seems like an extraordinary skill for documentarian, especially when you're dealing with unscripted, highly volatile scenes like these.
It really is. It means he understands the narrative flow instinct. He sees how that key moment of silence from D'Angelo will play against, utter chaos of the dinner.
Right. He's connecting the dots in real time.
He's playing those moments in his mind as they happen, constantly prioritizing what needs to be captured to serve the final story arc.
And the sources actually credit him with pioneering kind of a new genre, don't they? Having directed What is a Woman before this, and No Safe Spaces as well.
Yes.
He's credited with creating a documentary style that specifically allows them to push boundaries by using performance and satire to uncover deeper truths that maybe traditional, more earnest documentaries can't quite access in the same way.
And the strategic vision, this ability to execute it, was only possible because of the next major theme the sources really emphasized, the absolute power of trust within the...
Okay.
The director himself stated quite clearly that this was the first project he had ever worked on, regardless of the industry, Hollywood or otherwise, where he completely trusted everybody on his court. Anton, Rebecca, Sean, everyone.
That's a huge claim, especially in filmmaking, an industry often built on constant cross-checking and oversight.
It is huge. And it fundamentally changed his role on set. He didn't feel the need to micromanage everything. He said he never had to make sure that Anton had done his thing or make sure that Rebecca had sent that email.
He could focus on the bigger picture.
Exactly. His job, as he defined it, was simply to harness that talent and let those people run and just occasionally remind them of the overarching strategic vision, that deep reciprocal trust. That's what allowed the team to take the massive risks inherent in this type of filmmaking.
And the team clearly reflected that confidence back toward. Sean Hampton provided a really great quote that kind of synthesized the director's essential role in this kind of project.
What was that?
He said, directors are the only people who have seen the movie while we're making.
That's good. Yeah. Everyone else is operating on a partial understanding, right? Just supporting that singular, currently unseen vision in the director.
Exactly. And the sources stress that if you don't have absolute confidence in your director, especially when you're facing things like police calls and potential blacklisting risks, you have nothing. Trust was the essential glue, the thing that kept the whole high-stress operation from completely falling apart.
Absolutely critical.
Okay, so we have this meticulously planned film, executed under extreme duress, relying on absolute trust and an absurd disguise. But what was the ultimate philosophical goal? What was the point of all this risk and effort? The sources defined it. Very simple. Courage.
Courage, yeah. And that definition, it probably needs a little expansion. It wasn't just about the crew themselves being brave, they were.
Right.
It was more about giving the audience permission. Permission to do what? Permission to question things that were not allowed to be questioned, especially in that really toxic, polarized cultural...
So the film actively thought to challenge the central narrative being pushed by what they termed the anti-racist industry, this idea that America is fundamentally irredeemably racist down to its bones.
Yes, and the creators argued through the film and in the source material that this narrative of intrinsic, unavoidable American racism is ultimately debilitating. Because if that worldview is fully accepted, then white people, in their view, can only wallow in their guilt perpetually forever. And Black people are condemned to a state of victimhood with no escape. The film was an attempt to push back against reverse that cycle, that debilitating cycle, and suggest that maybe Americans are capable of rising above it.
And this successful pushback, this attempt to shift the narrative, it connects directly to a famous political philosophy, doesn't it? The Andrew Breitbart line that politics is downstream from culture.
That's the strategic key right there. For decades, the conservative space, broadly primarily focused on political battles, legislation, elections, judicial appointments.
Right, the nuts and bolts of power.
Exactly. The success of Am I Race, coming after What is a Woman, was for the creators this powerful, tangible demonstration that the conservative space can create culture and not just fight it.
That's a big shift.
That is everything, according to one source, because changing the culture is seen as the prerequisite, the necessary first step for eventually changing the politics long term.
So when the film finally premiered in theater, after all this stress and secrecy, the sources describe a really magical moment of validation for the team.
Yeah, sitting there in the theater anonymously, they experienced the true payoff. They heard the audience laugh out loud, gasp, and groan during all those uncomfortable parts.
The cringe parts.
The cringe parts, confirming that it just clicked. All the things they thought were hilarious or pointedly absurd, the intentional cringe, the disguise, the satire, were indeed hitting the audience exactly as they had intended.
So it confirmed their thesis, essentially, that humor could break through where maybe straightforward facts or arguments couldn't.
That seems to be how they interpreted it, yes.
So after tackling this incredibly difficult topic in the most stressful way imaginable, what did the creators ultimately conclude about the state of race in America based on their experience making the film?
Well, their final conclusion, perhaps surprisingly, was fundamentally optimistic, despite the dire subject matter they were exploring. They came away believing that most Americans are actually not, that most people are simply focused on, getting through their day, doing the best they can for their family. They realized through the process that the bad ideas they felt were dominating the cultural battle.
The ones they were satirizing.
Right, were being propagated by a powerful, vocal, a well-funded but a very, very small minority of people.
So the power of the anti-racist industry, as they saw it, is based more on volume and funding, not necessarily widespread public acceptance of its core tenets.
Precise. That was their takeaway. They felt that once they stepped outside that very insulated political or academic bubble and actually talked to the average person on the street, those dominating cultural ideas had a lot less power than you think it is. The core fundamental lesson they sought to impart with the film, and maybe the lesson they took themselves from making it, was incredibly simple at its heart. To love people with your heart and not look at skin.
Back to that original ideal.
In a way, yes. The film's production was a test of that, and they felt their success, the audience reaction, was a testament to the belief that the average American still shares this fundamental desire for harmony, regardless. #outro.
Well, this deep dive into the production of Am I Racist has really revealed that the final film wasn't just a documentary. It was an engineered product of profound logistical risk, absolute creative trust, and the strategic deployment of discomfort and humor.
Yeah, it really was. We've seen how intense confidentiality demanded the producer literally cook the catering herself.
Incredible.
How the fear of blacklisting required the anonymity of the football disguise, and how those totally unscripted moments, like D'Angelo's visible distress under the pressure of pure silence, became maybe the most powerful tool of the final narrative.
The entire operation, as you said, was framed as a successful demonstration of culture creation, moving past just political resistance to actively trying to define the conversation itself.
Yeah, it affirmed the team's belief, it seems, that to achieve real impact, you sometimes have to be willing to be the person awkwardly dropping the butter or maybe fleeing the police and definitely wearing a...
And as we close out this deep dive, the source material offers one final provocative thought for us and for you listening, something that builds directly on the film's premise. It's about the consequence of the widespread, maybe indiscriminate use of the term racist.
Right. The question raised is this. If the anti-racist movement or certain elements of it operates under the premise that basically everyone and everything is racist, does the word itself begin to lose its meaning, its power? One of the creators posed the fundamental question, if they call everybody racist, what is the actual social consequence of that? And the conclusion drawn in the source material was that the widespread, often aggressive, and sometimes politically weaponized application of the term ultimately diffuses its power. It waters it.
So the idea is that if they call everybody racist, nobody is racist now. The word ceases to carry the necessary weight to enact genuine moral or cultural change.
That's the provocative thought left hanging. It forces us and to consider whether the constant escalation of accusations, however well-intentioned sometimes, ultimately renders the criticism itself, well, meaningless in the long run.
A lot to think about there. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive, and we encourage you to consider the immense, often hidden creative logistics required to successfully challenge dominant cultural ideas in our very polarized world.